chapter. Okay. Chapter 15. Oh, my hair looks terrible. Whatever. Chapter 15. The end of this story and the beginning of all others. Literally, that's the title. The end of this story and the beginning of all others. You need no rings when I am with you, said the voice of Aslan. The children blinked and looked about them. They were once more in the wood between the worlds. Uncle Andrew lay on the grass, still asleep, and Aslan stood beside them. Come, said Aslan, it is time that you went back, but there are two things you need to see first. A warning and a command. Look here, children. And they looked, and they saw a little hollow in the grass, with a grassy bottom, warm and dry. When you were here last, said Aslan, that hollow was a pool, and when you jumped into it, you came into the world where there was a dying sun shone over the ruins of Charn. There is no pool now. That world has ended, as if it had never been. Let the race of Adam and Eve take warning. Yes, Aslan, both children said. But Polly added, but we're not quite as bad as that world, are we, Aslan? Not yet, daughter of Eve, he said, not yet, but you are growing more like that. It is not certain that some wicked one of your race will not find out a secret as evil as the deplorable word, and use it to destroy all living things. And soon, very soon, before you are an old man and an old woman, great nations in your world will be ruled by tyrants who care no more for joy and justice and mercy than the Empress of Jadis. Let your world beware. This is the warning. Now for the command. As soon as you take it, take from this uncle of yours his magic rings and bury them so that no one can use them again. Both children were looking up into the lion's face as he spoke these words, and all at once, they never knew exactly how it happened, the face seemed to be a sea of tossing gold in which they were floating, and such a sweetness and power rolled about them and over them that they entered them that they felt they had never really been happy or wise or good or even alive and awake before. And the memory of that moment stayed with them always, so as long as they both lived. If ever they were sad or afraid or angry, and they thought of all the golden goodness and the feeling that it was still there, quite close, just around the corner or just behind some door, would come back and make them sure deep down inside that all was well. The next minute, all three of them, Uncle Andrew now awake, came tumbling into the noise, heat, and hot smells of London. They were on pavement outside the Ketterleys' front door, except that the witch, the horse, and the cabby were gone. Everything else was exactly as they had left it. There was the lamppost with one arm missing. There was the wreck of the hansom cab. There was a crowd. Everyone was still talking, and people were still kneeling beside the damaged policeman, saying things like, "He's coming round! How you feeling now, old champ? The ambulance will get here in a jiffy." Great Scott, thought Diggory, I believe the whole adventure's taken no time at all. Most people were wildly looking around for Jadis and the horse. No one took any notice of the children, for no one had seen them go or noticed them coming back. As for Uncle Andrew, what had been between the state of his clothes and the honey in his face, he could not have been recognized by anyone. Fortunately, the front door of the house was open, and the housemaid was standing in the doorway, staring at the fun. What a day that girl was having! So the children had no difficulty in bustling Uncle Andrew indoors before anyone asked questions. He raced up the stairs before them, and they were very afraid that he was heading for his attic, which meant the remaining of his magic rings. But they needn't be bothered. What he was thinking about was the bottle in his wardrobe and he disappeared at once into his bedroom and locked the door. When he came out again, which was not for a good long time, he was in his dressing gown and made straight for the bathroom. "Can you get the other rings, Paul?" said Diggory. "I want to go see Mother." "Right, see you later," said Polly, and clattered up the attic stairs. Then Diggory took a minute to get his breath and went softly into his mother's room. And there she lay, as he had seen her lie so many other times, propped up by pillows, with a thin, pale face that would make you cry to look at it. Diggory took the apple of life out of his pocket. And just as the witch Jadis had looked differently when you saw her in our world instead of her own, so the fruit in that mountain garden looked different too. There were, of course, all sorts of colored things in the bedroom, the colored counterpane on the bed, the wallpaper, the sunlight from the window, and Mother's pretty, pale blue dressing jacket. But the moment Diggory took the apple out of his pocket, all those things seemed to have scarcely any color at all. Every one of them, even the sunlight, looked faded and dingy. The brightness of the apple threw strange lights on the ceiling. Nothing else was worth looking at. You couldn't look at anything else. And the smell of the apple of youth was there, in the window of the room that opened on heaven. "Oh, darling, how lovely," said Diggory's mother. "You will eat it, won't you, please?" said Diggory. "I don't know what the doctor would say," she said, "but I feel as if I almost could." He peeled it and cut it up and gave it to her piece by piece, and no sooner had she finished it than she smiled, and her head sank back on the pillow and she was asleep. A real, natural, gentle sleep without any of those nasty drugs, which was, as Diggory knew, the thing in the world that she wanted most. So sweet. Love it. And he was now sure that her face looked a little different. He bent down and kissed her very softly and stole out of the room with a beating heart, taking the core of the apple with him. For the rest of the day, wherever he looked at things about him, he saw how ordinary and unmagical they were. He hardly dared to hope. But when he remembered the face of Aslan, he did hope. That evening he buried the core of the apple in the back garden. Next morning, when the doctor made his usual visit, Diggory leaned over the banisters to listen. He heard the doctor come out with Aunt Letty and say, "Miss Ketterly, this is the most extraordinary case I have known in my whole medical career. It's like a miracle. I wouldn't tell the little boy anything at present. We don't want to raise any false hopes. But in my opinion," and then his voice became too low to hear. That afternoon he went down to the garden and whistled their agreed secret signal for Polly. She hadn't been able to get back the day before. "What luck?" said Polly, looking over the wall. "I mean, about your mother." I think it's going to be all right," said Diggory, "but if you don't mind, I'd really rather not talk about it yet." "What about the rings?" "I've got them all," said Polly. Look, it's all right. I'm wearing gloves. Let's bury them." "Yes, let's. I've marked a place where I buried the core of the apple yesterday." Then Polly came over the wall, and they went together to the place. But as it turned out, Diggory need not have marked the place. Something was already coming up. It was not growing so you could see it now as trees had done in Narnia, but it was already well above ground. They got a trowel and buried the magic rings, including their own ones, in a circle around it. About a week after this, it was quite certain that Diggory's mother was getting better. About a fortnight, 2 weeks, later, she was able to sit out in the garden. And a month later, that whole house had become a different place. Aunt Letty did everything that Mother'd like. Windows were open, frowsy curtains were drawn back and brightened up the rooms. There were new flowers everywhere and nice things to eat, and the old piano was tuned, and Mother took up her singing again, and it was such games with Diggory and Polly that Aunt Letty would say, "I declare, Mabel, you are the biggest baby of the three." When things go wrong, you'll find out that usually go on and get worse for some time, but when things start going better, they often get going better and better. After about 6 weeks of this lovely life, there came to be a letter from Father in India, which had a wonderful news in it. Old great uncle Kirk had died, and this meant, apparently, that Father was now very rich. He was going to retire and come home from India forever and ever, and the great big house in the country which Diggory had heard of all of his life, never seen, would now be their home. The big house with suits of armor and stables and kennels and the river and park and the hot houses and vineries and the woods and the mountains behind it. So Diggory felt for sure that they were all going to live happily ever after. But perhaps you'd like to know just one or two more things. Polly and Diggory were always great friends. She nearly came every holiday to stay with them in this beautiful house in the country, and that is where she learned to ride and swim and milk and bake and climb. In Narnia, beasts live in the great peace and joy, and neither the witch nor any other enemy came to trouble that pleasant land for many 100 years. King Frank and Queen Helen and their children lived happily in Narnia, and their second son became king of Archland. The boys married nymphs, and the girls married wood gods and river gods. The lamppost, which the witch had planted without knowing it, shone day and night in the Narnian forest, so that the place where it grew became known as Lantern Waste. And when many years later another child from our world got into Narnia on a snowy night, she found that light still burning. And that adventure, in a way, is connected with the ones I have just begun telling you. It was like this. The tree which sprang from the apple that Diggory planted in the back garden lived and grew into a fine tree. Growing in the soil of our world, far out of the sound of Aslan's voice and far from the young Narnia air, it did not bear apples that would revive a dying woman, as Diggory's mother had been revived, though it did bear apples more beautiful than any others in England, and they were extremely good for you, though not fully magical. But inside itself, in the very sap of the tree, so to say, never forget that a tree of Narnia to which it belonged. Sometimes it would move mysteriously when there was no wind blowing. I think that when this happened, there were high winds in Narnia, and the English tree quivered because at that moment the tree was rocking and swaying strong in a southwestern gale. However that might be, it was proved later that there was still magic in the wood. When Diggory was quite middle-aged and became a famous, learned man, a professor, and a great traveler in that time, the Ketterleys' old house belonged to him. There was a great storm over the south of England which blew the tree down. He couldn't bear to simply have it chopped up for firewood, so he had part of the timber made into a wardrobe, which he'd put in his big house in the country. And though he himself did not discover the magic properties of that wardrobe, somebody else did. That was the beginning of all the comings and goings between Narnia and our world, which you can read in the other books. When Diggory and his people went to live in the big country house, they took Uncle Andrew to live with them, for Diggory's father said, "We must try to keep the old fellow out of mischief, and it isn't fair that poor Letty should have him always in her hands." Uncle Andrew never tried any magic again as long as he lived. He had learned his lesson, and in his old age he became nicer and less selfish of an old man he had been before. He always liked to get visitors alone in the billiard room and tell them stories about a mysterious lady, a foreign royalty with whom he had been driven out of London. A devilish temper she had, but he would say, "But she was a dem fine woman, sir, a dem fine woman." And that is the end of The Magician's Nephew. We will be reading the next book in this series, The Chronicles of Narnia, called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And if you remember our movie that we watched before spring break, the last day I saw you guys, that's the movie based off of the next book. So we're going into book 2 next. I hope you guys enjoyed The Magician's Nephew. Love and support you. Have a great weekend.